Over the past 3 decades, the Final Fantasy series has featured plenty of iconic characters and gameplay elements. But one of the most consistent areas of growth and consistency has to be its roster of monsters. In this regard, focus is often placed around the more prominent antagonists and boss encounters. But the reality is that more time is spent squaring off against the general rank and file. And as there have now been over 100 different Final Fantasy games produced, an extensive catalogue of enemies has been created from which developers can call upon should they wish. Within this catalogue, some monsters have appeared with a higher frequency than others. As such, these entities have become acknowledged as quintessential foes that have grown to embody the Final Fantasy spirit, and many have become legendary due to a combination of their visuals but also their in-game mechanics. It's these legendary monsters that we'll be covering in today's video. But as a note, we won't be discussing monsters that are unique to specific games. Instead, the purpose is to cover those monsters that have become so deep-rooted within the franchise that it's a surprise when they don't appear. So strap yourselves in as we venture through 7 of the most legendary monsters in Final Fantasy history, and we're going to begin with a true classic, the Mulbara. Enemies that deal unexpected amounts of damage are often those that are most feared when it comes to random encounters. These brutes can lead to a quick game over, and when this happens, it's often just a case of dusting yourself off, accepting what happened, and moving on. But there's also another type of enemy that appears in random encounters, and these enemies, through the use of horrible status effects, can elicit a very different type of emotion should the outcome of the encounter also be a game over. One of the most iconic monsters to embody this trait has to be the Mulbara. They have appeared in nearly every game since Final Fantasy II, with this design representing some kind of monstrous plant that featured massive jaws and numerous tentacles with eyes at the tips of each of them. But their fame and notoriety has to be attributed to their ability to inflict a variety of horrible status effects. In their original form, this saw Mulbaras able to inflict paralysis when landing melee strikes. But when they returned in Final Fantasy IV, they were granted access to 2 abilities called Breath and Bad Breath, and from this point forward, they have been a consistent source of ire. Bad Breath was also introduced in Final Fantasy II, but it was associated with variants of Chimera. Here, it had a chance to inflict Petrify on all targets, and as the Petrify status would result in inaction, should it land, unlucky parties could see Bad Breath lead to an instant and unexpected game over. In Final Fantasy IV, Breath had the potential to inflict Confuse, Toad, Mini, Pig, Silence, and Blind on a single party member. Bad Breath, which could be used by the Great Mulbara, then took things further, able to inflict all of these status effects on all party members at the same time. If the party had no immunity, this combination of status effects would be very painful. Final Fantasy VI would then see Bad Breath upgraded, as it would include Poison and Sap in the roster of painful status effects. But it would be Final Fantasy VIII where the Mulbaras would be their most notorious. Found most often on the islands closest to Heaven and Hell, Mulbara would use an enhanced Bad Breath that would add Sleep, Berserk, Petrify, and Curse to its laundry list of status effects. But what made it worse was that Bad Breath would always be the first ability used. So if you were ambushed and didn't have immunity against, say, Confuse and Berserk, you would have no choice but to watch as your party proceeded to kill itself. Final Fantasy X would then replicate this exact experience. Since then, within main numbered games and numerous spin-off titles, Mulbara have continued to be a thorn in the side of players, and sometimes this has even led to their status being upgraded. Numerous notorious monster variants were seen in Final Fantasy XI and XIV, and other games such as Stranger of Paradise and more recently Final Fantasy XVI have even included Mulbara boss fights. And this has helped to epitomise Mulbara as one of the most recognisable and frustrating monsters ever created in relation to the franchise. Now, in the early stages of any game, a significant focus is placed around introducing players to the game's settings and mechanics through tutorials and hands-on experiences. This often involves the introduction of low difficulty opponents to help ease new players into the game. And one of the most common enemies to assume this particular role has to be the Goblin. Goblins were first seen in the original Final Fantasy, and they had very poor stats and no unique abilities. In fact, all they could do was perform a basic melee attack. This would be much the same until Final Fantasy V, when goblins were finally granted access to something other than a basic melee attack, a fun ability called Goblin Punch. But what's curious is that this ability had been introduced in the previous iteration. It just couldn't be used by goblins. Well, not enemy goblins at least. Final Fantasy IV introduced a whole new range of summons, and amongst them were 4 generic monsters, one of which was the Goblin. When called upon, it would use Goblin Punch to deal non-elemental damage. Even though this move was seldom seen, as acquiring the Goblin as a summon was so tedious that most people would have never even bothered, it meant Goblin Punch became canonically linked with goblins from this point forward. In Final Fantasy V, Goblin Punch would deal physical damage, but its damage could be boosted if the targeted player was the same level as the Goblin using the ability. In this fringe occurrence, it could see the move deal up to 8 times the standard output, and this would make goblins much less of a pushover. Final Fantasy XI would also see a significant evolution around the role of goblins, and this carried through to Final Fantasy XIV. Instead of simply being standard enemies, goblins were elevated to being one of the many civilized beastmen races. This meant goblins could now be helpful NPCs and allies, with agendas even being denoted by their naming conventions. Out in the field, goblins were also aggressive, and were often some of the stronger enemies found in areas associated with the base version of Final Fantasy XI. The Valcom Dunes and Utunga Jungle were notorious for this, as if a goblin was accidentally aggroed and used Bomb Toss, it could lead to a full party wipe. Beyond this, there have also been numerous goblins that have circumvented the image of being a weak starter class of enemy, and this has been epitomised by the Goblin Prince from Final Fantasy IV and the demonic incarnations that were seen in Final Fantasy XV. It meant that, although goblins have somewhat borne the broad image of being weak and easy to bully, they would evolve over the course of the series to become very unique. One of the more interesting gameplay loop innovations over the years has to be the introduction of self-destructing enemies. They would compel players to defeat certain enemies early for fear of being on the receiving end of huge damage numbers. This type of enemy was first introduced in Final Fantasy II, with the weakest variation of an enemy that used this type of ability called the Balloon. If they were hit and survived, self-destruct would initiate, ensuring that if they were going to fall in battle themselves, they would at least attempt to take as many of the playable party with them as possible. Numerous variations of Balloon would feature throughout Final Fantasy II, including the Grenade and Mine, but the one that has since become a mainstay is the Bomb. True to their name, bombs have become renowned for their self-destruct ability, which serves as their primary means of dealing damage. This ability would activate either when their HP fell below a certain value, or when they sustained a specific number of hits. And as they were often associated with the fire element, this ability has sometimes carried a fire elemental affinity. What's curious about this specific point though, is that despite this elemental affinity, in earlier iterations of the franchise, bombs were actually weak to fire. It wasn't until Final Fantasy VI where bombs would develop a recurring susceptibility to ice and water abilities, then shifting to either nullify or absorb fire. As the franchise progressed, bombs would become a staple adversary in most of the games, and the self-destructibility would be transitioned to a consistent mechanic. But when the 3D era arrived, bombs also gained another interesting trait. They would inflate in size, something which served as a visual cue to indicate their proximity to them using self-destruct. And this would go on to become one of the most iconic features of the bomb. Outside of this core enemy type, formidable iterations of bomb have also been created, with entities like the Mom Bomb from Final Fantasy IV and numerous Bomb Kings who have appeared in quite a few games now. These variants would pose a greater challenge with different avenues of exploding damage-dealing tactics. One of the best examples of this has to be Final Fantasy XII's King Bomb. This would complicate proceedings by summoning smaller bomb allies, which would then be used to create devastating abilities like Chain Reaction. By this point, it means bombs have become the de facto representative for self-destructing enemies, and they're now emblematic for forcing players to act much faster than they were perhaps intending to. One of the most notorious combat elements for players to be wary of are abilities that can inflict sudden death, some of which can even take the most beefed up parties by surprise. Encountering foes possessing instant kill abilities can therefore be a nerve-wracking ordeal, often necessitating players to tread carefully. And one of the most infamous for pulling out this trick has to be the Ahriman. After making its debut in Final Fantasy III, the Ahriman would go on to appear in most games as a demonic, one-eyed entity with bat-like wings and sharp teeth. But what's curious, however, is that in Final Fantasy III, Ahriman was an important storyline boss that served as one of the guardians of the Dark Crystals, as opposed to being a standard monster. Final Fantasy V would then make this separation, as they appeared in the Lunar Subterrane, and this particular appearance would lay the foundation for the Ahriman's subsequent recurring association with death-inflicting spells. As while its boss incarnation in Final Fantasy III did showcase a range of potent abilities, it wasn't until Final Fantasy IV that Ahriman first wielded the Count, or Doom skill. Later games would continue to build upon this archetype, seeing many other death spells associated with Ahriman, but Gaze would also become part of the makeup, with this move able to inflict other frustrating status effects such as Paralyze and Petrification. Due to this repertoire of moves, Ahriman have often been considered quite tough enemies, and Final Fantasy XIV made note of this by featuring a variant of the Final Fantasy III boss as part of its Crystal Tower Raid series. That difficulty, along with its eye-catching design, have made the Ahriman become a favourite amongst developers, something that has created a now iconic enemy type. As the years have passed, more and more odd-looking monsters have been created, and some notable entries in this regard have to be the Hell House and Ozma. But perhaps one of the more intriguing is also the Cactuar. It's difficult to imagine when Cactuars were introduced in Final Fantasy VI that they would transcend their initial role as a random encounter monster in such a significant way. But Cactuars have since become an official mascot of the franchise as a whole, often seen alongside Moogles and Chocobos. In that initial appearance, Cactuars featured a three-holed face, and they were often frozen in place sporting a running stance, as if pretending to be an actual plant. As such, they seemed quite timid, and this served to lull players into a false sense of security. Cactuars did have very low HP, but they compensated for this by having remarkably high defensive and evasive stats. They could also make use of a horrible ability called 1000 Needles. This would deal 1000 points of non-elemental damage to a single target, and it could not be blocked. Should the Cactuar not be defeated fast enough, they could also unleash an enhanced version, which would see them cast 10 1000 Needles in a row, dealing 10,000 points of damage. Defeating them was therefore quite difficult, but also a necessity, and as a reflection of this, Cactuars offered significant rewards upon being vanquished. Perhaps one of the more intriguing elements about this though was that 1000 Needles had appeared in Final Fantasy V. Here it was associated with an enemy called Cactus, but instead of being a similar nod to an actual cactus, it was the name of a weird looking mouse crustacean. Final Fantasy VIII would then elevate the role of Cactuar through the addition of the Jumbo Cactuar. This colossal incarnation would sport a moustache, perhaps suggesting a more mature or advanced form of Cactuar. It would also be far more powerful, having the ability to use 10,000 needles, which would deal 10,000 damage. Ever since, Cactuars have been viewed more as a special enemy, but they can still be very tough to beat, and their visual appearance is often used to provide some much needed comic relief. Another franchise mascot that often appears alongside Cactuars, Moogles and Chocobos is the Tonberry. Now, in any game, there's always that tough random encounter that players will prefer to steer clear of. Wormek serves as the poster child for this, but there's also the aforementioned Mulbra in Final Fantasy VIII and the Brachiosaur in Final Fantasy VI. But perhaps the monster that has made Final Fantasy fans sweat with the highest degree of consistency has to be the Tonberry. This particular enemy would first appear in Final Fantasy V, and part of the appeal, similar to the Cactuar, was its deceptive and diminutive appearance. Depicted as a small, green creature dressed in a robe and holding a lantern, the only real apparent threat would be a small kitchen knife it held. But that knife would get ever closer, as each turn the Tonberry would adjust its position to get closer to the party. This act created a sense of impending doom, especially as due to their very high HP, each Tonberry seemed like a slow-moving tank that could not be stopped. Should the Tonberry then get close enough, it would proceed to use Chef's Knife, a move that would ignore defense, inflict sap, and deal considerable damage. As the franchise developed, this creeping would be made much more ominous, and the Tonberry would gain access to other moves such as Everyone's Grudge. This ability first appeared in Final Fantasy VII, and it could be used by an evolved form of Tonberry called the Master Tonberry. This move would deal unblockable, non-elemental damage to the second character that attacked the Tonberry, and its damage would be the equivalent to 10 times the number of enemies that character had slain throughout the game. This concept would then be taken to the extreme within Final Fantasy XI. An even stronger version of Everyone's Grudge called Everyone's Rancor could be used by Tombury Notorious monsters. Its damage was then linked with an invisible modifier called Tombury Hate, which would increase every time a Tombury was defeated in combat. It's aspects like this that have made Tombury feared, and variants such as the Mega Tombury in Final Fantasy X-2 and the Master Tombury in Final Fantasy XV have only added to the legacy, especially as the incredible damage output is balanced with an adorable visual style. And that then brings us on to the Behemoth. Now, this particular enemy has become infamous, not just because of its in-game representation, but also because of how it's pronounced. Some people say Behemoth, while others say Behemoth. The good thing is that neither is wrong, because no matter how it's pronounced, we all know exactly what we're talking about, as that class of enemy has become one of the most defining across the entire franchise. Now, even though concept art was produced in relation to the original Final Fantasy, the Behemoth did not appear until Final Fantasy II, and it did so as both a random encounter and as a boss. As a random encounter, those unfortunate enough to stumble upon a Behemoth near Mysidia during the early game were in for a rude awakening. Each enemy would have a huge pool of HP with high attack and defensive stats that made any prolonged encounter quite punishing. A much harder variant known as the King Behemoth was also introduced. This was also a random encounter and a boss. In the initial instance, a King Behemoth would be found guarding the rune axe inside the Jade Passage. They could then be found later inside Pandemonium. After this, the Behemoth continued to resurface as either a very tough random encounter or a mini-boss, and over time they would start to gain abilities that would further add to the legend. In Final Fantasy IV, Behemoths had the ability to counter all attacks. Physical attacks would be met with a swift physical rebuttal, while magic attacks would be countered with Maelstrom. Final Fantasy VI then added the association with Meteor, used as a counter to Espers. Throughout this time, the design of the Behemoth was kept very consistent, but later games, such as Final Fantasy XII and XIII, will be much more creative. In Final Fantasy XII, this would see the Behemoth transformed into a sword-wielding biped, and in Final Fantasy XIII, they were made into cyborgs that were part of the Psycom arsenal. Each iteration would contain its relatively high strength in comparison to the other rank-and-file enemies faced as random encounters or sub-bosses. But whereas Behemoths have always been considered tough, they have never quite reached the level of Super Boss, except perhaps expanded content that was created for Final Fantasy XV. Behemoths have instead served as something of an intermediary, used as a benchmark to stress test a player's mettle along the straight and narrow. But it's perhaps because of this that Behemoths have come to serve as an iconic symbol for a player's progression throughout each game they appear in. And with that, they were 7 of the most iconic monsters from across the entire Final Fantasy series. What are your memories of encountering them for the first time? And are there any you feel would have been better placed on this list? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit that like button and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Adam Aguilara, Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Galson D. Kajata, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Zukin TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.